I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
7 minutes ago, the palace released a declaration no royal watcher believed could ever be written. Camilla's position as Queen Consort has been terminated with immediate effect, and Princess Anne has been formally appointed to replace her beside the king. There was no gradual transition, no ceremonial farewell, and no time for private negotiation. One announcement changed the hierarchy, and behind its carefully chosen words stood a family already breaking apart. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla read the declaration twice. Her fingers tightened around the page, and when her secretary entered, she asked why nobody had warned her. The sealed statement carried King Charles's signature, the royal seal, and an exact activation time. The royal seal is the official mark proving that an order carries the monarch's authority, meaning this was no rumor, temporary punishment, or decision open to appeal. Anne received the same document at St. James's Palace and remained standing as she read it. She placed it on the table, then told her aide she had never asked to take another woman's place. Yet the Princess Royal understood its weight. Queen Consort is the title given to the wife of a reigning king, but this extraordinary arrangement transferred the duties beside the monarch to his sister without ending the marriage itself. One sentence cut deeper than the rest. The change, it declared, was necessary to protect the continuity, discipline, and credibility of the crown during internal instability. That wording mattered because the crown means more than the person wearing it. It describes the monarchy as an institution whose authority depends on public trust. Camilla heard humiliation without any warning. Anne heard duty. Charles heard the cost of a betrayal he believed he could no longer ignore. The king sat alone after authorizing the release, staring at the pen he had used while repeated knocks went unanswered. He had signed before dawn, long before his wife knew, proving the decision had been prepared in silence. Across the palace, William cancelled 2 meetings and demanded a private briefing. The Prince of Wales understood that the public statement revealed only the surface. Then came the line nobody could explain. A second sealed document existed, but the palace refused to publish it. Anne would not accept the position publicly until she learned what Camilla had done and why her brother had waited until that morning to act. But the announcement could not be understood through titles alone, because behind those titles stood 3 people bound by marriage, blood, loyalty, and a wound none of them could conceal. The palace statement reduced the crisis to a change of royal responsibility, but no official wording could contain the personal devastation underneath it. Camilla had spent years fighting for acceptance beside Charles. Anne had built her identity around service without seeking a crown, and the king now stood between the wife he defended for decades and the sister whose loyalty had never required defending. For each of them, the announcement carried a different kind of loss. Camilla felt that loss before anyone dared explain it. She had survived years of public anger, cold palace corridors, and whispered doubts about whether she truly belonged beside the monarch. The consort role, the position held by the reigning king's spouse, carrying ceremonial duties but no independent sovereign power, had become proof that the institution had finally accepted her. Now that proof had vanished in a single morning. Anne felt no victory. She had earned respect through decades of difficult engagements, military associations, and service carried out without demanding affection in return. That was why palace officials believed she could assume immediate ceremonial authority without causing further chaos. Yet in a closed meeting, the Princess Royal told William that duty could not erase the cruelty of replacing someone within her own family. He heard anger in her voice, not ambition. Charles remembered something worse. Years earlier, he had promised his wife privately that she would never again be left alone before public judgment. Now his own signature had broken that promise. The king held an old photograph of himself and his sister as children when William entered the study, and the image revealed what his silence would not. Trust between them had begun long before Camilla entered royal life. Camilla removed the diamond brooch prepared for that evening and placed it inside its case. She told her aide that the palace had not changed her schedule. It had erased her future. Her words were recorded in the aide's written account, preserving the moment long after the room fell silent. William pressed his father for the truth. The monarch said Anne had been chosen because she commanded respect across the family, the armed forces, and the palace staff. But he still refused to explain why everything had happened immediately. Then the private memorandum surfaced. A memorandum is an internal written record used to explain decisions and responsibilities. It showed that Camilla had attempted to expand the consort's office, placing several royal functions beneath advisors personally loyal to her. Anne refused to wear any consort insignia, the badges and symbols marking the role, until she heard Camilla's account face to face. William finally revealed that the crisis had begun during one specific ceremony 3 weeks earlier, when the Queen Consort issued an instruction that directly contradicted the king. And when William named the ceremony, Charles finally looked up, because everyone in that room knew it had been the moment from which there was no return. 3 weeks before the palace announcement, the royal family gathered for what should have been a controlled ceremony of unity. Instead, one instruction delivered in a guarded corridor created a rupture that could no longer be hidden. Camilla believed she was protecting the future of her office. Anne believed the crown's authority had been challenged. Charles attempted to contain the dispute privately, but by the end of that evening, a written warning was already being prepared. Anne noticed the change minutes before the royal service of continuity began at Windsor Castle. The ceremony required senior family members to sign a symbolic pledge defining their responsibilities during the king's reign, making its order more than decoration. She lifted the revised seating card, studied it without speaking, then asked the waiting official who had authorized her name to be moved. Camilla answered before anyone else could. She drew the Princess Royal into the adjoining corridor and insisted that the monarchy could not function while the king's wife remained beneath his sister in the final order of precedence. That order is the formal ranking that decides where royals stand, sit, and appear during official duties. The Queen Consort argued that her office needed visible authority if palace staff were expected to obey it. Anne did not raise her voice. She told Camilla that precedence was not a reward for personal acceptance, but a discipline protecting the structure of the crown. The monarch's sister warned that changing it without written approval crossed a dangerous line because it allowed one household to speak as though it carried sovereign authority. Charles arrived as the confrontation ended. He opened the ceremonial folder, found the replacement page, and tore it free. The king ordered the original arrangement restored before anyone entered the chamber. When his wife accused him of weakening her publicly, he answered that she had weakened herself by issuing a command in his name without permission. The damage had already spread. That evening, the keeper of the privy records submitted a breach memorandum, an internal report documenting conduct that may violate royal procedure, and recommended an immediate review of the consort's powers. William later learned through that written record that Windsor was not an isolated incident. 3 earlier instructions had redirected staff appointments, patronage announcements, and access privileges toward Camilla's private office. Anne still urged her brother not to humiliate his wife before the public. She believed the family could survive a private correction, but Charles discovered the altered ceremonial document had already reached several senior officials. Silence was no longer protection. It had become permission. The monarch summoned Camilla for a final confrontation. His sister waited nearby, while an unsigned removal order rested on the desk between loyalty and consequence. By the time Camilla entered that room, the argument was no longer about a seating card. It was about whether the crown still answered to one sovereign voice. There were no cameras, no private secretaries, and no carefully rehearsed smiles when Camilla entered the king's study. Charles stood behind his desk, with the Windsor memorandum open before him. Anne waited near the fireplace, not as a rival, but as the witness Camilla least wanted present. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Charles pushed the altered ceremony page across the desk and asked his wife one question. "Did you authorize this?" Camilla admitted it. She said palace officials had continued treating her office as decorative when it was meant to support the reign at its center. The Windsor precedence document, The formal paper setting the order in which senior royals appear and perform duties had seemed to her like proof that nothing had truly changed. She claimed she had acted to protect the authority expected of the king's wife. Anne stepped forward before Charles could answer. She told the queen consort that respect could not be manufactured by moving names across a page. The Princess Royal said she had knowingly used the monarch's authority without permission, then warned that such power could not be borrowed through marriage. Camilla turned on her. She accused Anne of building a silent alliance with William, one designed to control Charles whenever he became emotionally uncertain. The accusation landed hard. The king struck the desk once with his palm, shocking both women into silence. He declared that neither his wife nor his sister would speak, as though he had already lost command of the crown. Charles opened another folder. 3 additional directives carried Camilla's approval marks, including a proposal to replace senior household officials with advisors selected by her private secretary. A royal household is the staff structure supporting official duties, schedules,
the pen was still wet when the guards changed. That single detail, recorded later by a junior clerk who happened to be passing the king's study that morning, became the first proof that something inside the palace of Aldenmore had shifted before a single word reached the public. By the time the formal notice went up on the palace gates, the decision was already hours old, already irreversible, already something that could not be quietly withdrawn. The declaration was brief. Queen Consort Isolde's public duties were suspended with immediate effect, and Princess Eleanor, the king's elder sister, would assume the ceremonial responsibilities beside him until further notice. There was no explanation offered beyond a single line about protecting the stability of the crown during a period of internal strain. For a monarchy built on centuries of careful, telegraphed transitions, the abruptness alone was the story. Isolde read the notice twice before she understood it was final. Those close to the household later described her reaction not as fury, but as a kind of stillness, the particular quiet of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about their own position. She had spent nearly 2 decades earning her place inside a family that had, in its earliest years, treated her as an outsider who happened to marry well. The consort role, the formal title given to the spouse of a reigning monarch, carrying ceremonial duties and public visibility, but no independent constitutional authority, had become, for her, proof that the doubts had finally quieted. That proof disappeared in the space of a single morning memo. Eleanor received the same notice at her private residence and did something almost nobody expected. She asked for time before responding publicly. She had never sought the role she was being asked to fill, and those who knew her best understood that her hesitation wasn't false modesty. It was caution. A woman who had spent her adult life building a reputation for discipline and restraint does not walk eagerly into a position defined, in that moment, by someone else's public unraveling. She wanted to know what had actually happened before she agreed to stand in the middle of it. What had actually happened, according to accounts that later circulated among senior courtiers, began 3 weeks earlier during a ceremonial rehearsal that was supposed to be a formality. A seating arrangement, altered without the king's direct sign-off, placed Isolde ahead of Eleanor in the formal order of precedence, the strict hierarchy that determines where members of a royal family stand, sit, and appear during state occasions. It is a detail that sounds trivial to outsiders and is treated as anything but trivial inside a monarchy, where precedence is not a matter of personal preference, but a codified structure that signals, publicly and unambiguously, who answers to whom. Eleanor noticed the change before the ceremony began. She said nothing in the moment, but she raised it afterward, directly, without theatrics. The confrontation that followed, as later reconstructed by household staff, was not loud. Isolde argued that her office needed visible authority if the people beneath her were expected to respect it. Eleanor countered that precedence was never meant to function as personal validation. It existed to protect the structure of the institution itself, not the standing of any one person inside it. It was a disagreement about principle dressed as a disagreement about seating, and like most disagreements of that kind, it did not stay contained. Within days, further changes surfaced. Staffing decisions, patronage announcements, and access privileges that had quietly shifted toward advisors loyal specifically to Isolde's private office rather than the crown as a whole. When the king was finally shown the full pattern, not one incident but 4, spread across several weeks, his response, according to those present, was measured rather than explosive. He asked a single question, repeated to him almost verbatim by more than one witness. At what point does affection become permission? It is the kind of question that sounds almost philosophical until you understand what it was actually being asked about. Whether love for a spouse justified quietly overlooking decisions that, in any other context, would have been treated as an overreach of authority never granted. The king's dilemma was not really about ceremony at all. It was about the peculiar arithmetic of institutional trust, where a single unaddressed overstep can calcify into precedent if it goes unchallenged for too long. Historians of constitutional monarchies have long noted this pattern. Biographer and royal historian Robert Lacey, in his writing on the modern British monarchy, has described how much of a sovereign's real authority rests not on formal law, but on the accumulated weight of custom, and how quickly that weight can shift when custom is quietly rewritten from within a royal household rather than challenged openly. Fictional as this particular story is, the underlying mechanism it dramatizes, soft authority eroding through small, unchallenged decisions, mirrors patterns that royal historians have documented in real courts for generations. Eleanor did not want the position she was ultimately asked to accept. She said as much, plainly, in a private conversation that later became part of the household's internal account of that week. She had built her public identity on decades of unglamorous service, visits to regional hospitals, agricultural charities, veterans associations, precisely the kind of work that rarely makes headlines and therefore rarely invites scrutiny. She had never needed public affection to validate her role, which was exactly why senior officials believed she could absorb a sudden ceremonial burden without the transition collapsing into further chaos. But absorbing a burden and wanting it are two very different things, and Eleanor made sure everyone around her understood the difference. The king, for his part, could not offer his sister comfort without confronting his own responsibility for how long the situation had been allowed to develop. He admitted, in a moment later described by a close aide, that his reluctance to challenge his wife earlier had created the space in which the pattern grew. Protecting someone from criticism, he said, is not the same as protecting them from consequence. And by the time he understood the difference, the consequence had already arrived. It is a sentence that captures something true about power in any long relationship, royal or otherwise. The kindness of avoidance can, without anyone intending it, become the architecture of a much larger problem. Isolde's account of events, delivered privately and later summarized by staff who were present, was not one of calculated ambition, but of accumulated fear. She described years of feeling like a conditional presence inside an institution that had never fully closed the door on the possibility of her removal. Every restriction placed on her office, she said, felt like confirmation that the family was still waiting for a reason to push her out. That fear, she admitted, had driven decisions she would not have made calmly, expanding her authority not to seize power for its own